really don't want to get bathroom breaks. So this is anti-union intimidation. Sun is coming out. And so all of these things are going to come together in one of the most important events, Homestead Steel. Now, it's always called a strike, but it really wasn't a strike. It was at Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh, a big steel town. And I got to move. It was Andrew Carnegie. But Carnegie, he owned it. But his second in command was Henry Clay Frick. And Frick would become one of the richest men in the world. If you ever go to New York City on Fifth Avenue, it's the Frick Museum, his big mansion there. And he has, I mean, it's just all the wealth he had. And he bought these incredible works of art. You've been there? Oh, yeah. So it's the Frick Museum. It's unreal the amount of art this guy was able to buy. It makes me uncomfortable. At the same time, I'm really glad it's there so I can go look at it. You know, it's one of those weird things. It's right off of Central Park. Yeah, so you know, yeah, that area. And he wants to break the union. The Amalgamated Steelworkers Union had negotiated slightly higher wages, and Carnegie wanted to destroy it. So he started a lockout. And he left it to Frick. So they're going to lock it out to keep out the union and then destroy it. Force them to come back, take a pay cut, and therefore the union won't spread. It wasn't that the pay was that much. Carnegie was worried that its other steel mills would vote for a union. That's what he was worried about. Then he went to Scotland on this big trip to, that's where he did is set up a little scholarship for some students to go to college. And so he could act like this great philanthropist and statesman and left the dirty work to Frick, who didn't mind. Frick had no qualms. So they hired Pinkertons, who would be the thugs. And literally, the Pinkertons went through the toughest areas and got actual criminals. They went to the Bowery in New York City, on the Five Points area, and got some of the toughest, hard-nosed gangsters. And brought them back, where the term gangster was used, but and brought them in. They put the brand new barbed wire around it to keep the workers out, the members of the union. They got a new weapon called a Maxim gun. Has anyone ever heard of a Maxim gun? Yeah. What is it? Yeah, one of the first actual machine guns. Yeah. They still using those in World War II. They had a big tank of water running through it so the barrel didn't get too hot. Yeah. And you could fire about 200 rounds a minute. Jammed a lot. There were all kinds of gun control rules all over the United States. Hell and a half. The town I grew up in, Miles City, it was you couldn't have a gun in town. You had to give up your gun, your handgun, when you came into town. So those are really common, but these weapons were so new, no one even thought about it. And then they had the workers work overtime to get a little stockpile of steel and then shut it down, locked them out. And then they kicked the workers out of their company town. And they're paid in script so they couldn't have a place to live. The whole idea was break the union. And then they hired scabs, strike breakers. And these were new immigrants. They didn't really know what they were doing, but they thought we could just get the factory running a little bit then, protected by Pinkertons. And they're going to bring them in on the river by boat. And that picture on the right is showing that. And that is going to lead to a massive shootout by the desperate and terrified union members. Who knows what happened? They're trying to get their wages cut. A shootout, over 100 people were killed or wounded in that fight. In fact, for the first effort to bring in the scabs, the Pinkertons ran away. And so the workers won. And this came out, Frick tried to portray it as the union is making unreasonable demands. But public sympathy was with the workers. In fact, the governor of Pennsylvania didn't send out the brand new National Guard. And Frick was furious with them. I paid you good money to become governor. Where's the National Guard? But public sympathy was with the workers. A lot of workers had seen things like this happen before and put themselves in their shoes, especially the violence of the Pinkertons. But then, I think it's kind of funny. All they put down is Frick, but tried to stab him, wounded him. Frick was able to fight him off, but everything changed. Public sympathy made a reversal. All of a sudden, now the union went from being sympathetic workers like us to wanting them. Yeah, bomb throwing anarchists. And that, when public sympathy turned, and under pressure of the Harrison administration, the government, the state government sent in the National Guard, and the workers were put down. They call it a strike, but it really wasn't a strike. The union was broken. Workers took a third pay cut. Every leader of the union was blacklisted and couldn't work again. Carnegie knew what he did, destroyed the workers. They took bigger pay cuts, less, they took away their bathroom break, things like that, to punish them. But he felt guilty. And so built them an opera house. And that is why Pittsburgh has one of the nicest opera houses in America, because Carnegie felt guilty about how he treated the workers. So see, how can you be mad at me? You got an opera house after working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in a steel mill. Enjoy the opera. Yes. That was a problem. And remember I told you how the Knights were really fearful about strikes because they understood that. And they still got blamed for it. Yeah, the anarchists, time after time. Part of it is, when you become an ideologue, you believe your own, what was the story I was talking about? We're doing the Vietnam War and special topics, and we're watching something about this general was talking about how the United States just believed they could win the war. And he described when you are, you believe your own stuff, he described it as you drink your own bathwater and it tastes good. Okay. Meaning, I am so smart, everybody must agree with me. That's supposed to be a little gross. Good. But you remember it. So they soon called this carnivals of revenge. Capital versus labor. And workers demanding strikes, better wages. Here are young women outside of a sweatshop in New York City. And you notice this is Giddich, and they're it's a company. They're striking garment workers. Is right for this event called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Some of you know about, which we'll get to in about a week. And because of the fear of socialism, and that fear, especially about government, but also just socialism, no one really sure what it was to this day. And they didn't really know. Remember, I told you socialists fought all the time too. That's one of the problems. Gage is kind of right. They kind of keep disproving themselves. Government supported capital until Teddy Roosevelt, who became president in 1901, was the first American president who was at least as in equal to both sides, a fair arbiter. And then the New Deal under his cousin, there would be a pro-union president. And union membership exploded in the 1930s. Exploded. And so this would be a radical shift. There'd be a brief blip of labor unions. And for the first time in American history, the gap between the rich and the poor shrunk. For the first time in history. And then, no, it is not shrinking now. It's going the other way very fast. And so the height of union by the 1980s, we have an intensely anti-union president. Actually, Carter wasn't very pro-union, and Ronald Reagan was intensely anti-union. And I'm not going to explain the graphs. I'll explain this later. Just union membership dropped, and that's where we're at today. I'll come back to this. So, new heading, Gilded Age politics. We got a little bit about the political era at this time of populism. And once again, this has direct connection to today. So many things are going to happen. Labor unions, we talk about these kind of things, it builds on it. In fact, that's one of the things I always talk about, like a class like mine. As the year goes by, it gets easier and easier. Let me rephrase that. It becomes less hard sometimes for some people, but no, I think it does become easier. Things just build, and you start being able to fit things in there. You know, when I told you about knowledge is really important, the more stuff you know, the easier it is to learn new things, because you fit new things into what you already know. If it's all new, there's no place to fit. So this is talking about populism. And populism, this idea, sometimes you might hear it called grassroots. For regular people, I usually quote, and I'll explain that in a second. But ordinary people who felt like they're ignored by the political parties and the elite, they want a system that will protect them. I mean, Andrew Jackson tapped into that populist movement when his fight for small farmers, some workers, democracy. And we'll see this in the 1880s and 1890s. We'll see it in the New Deal. But ignored can be argued ignored about what? Is it economic issues or cultural issues? And ordinary? So many times in history, there'll be somebody claiming to represent ordinary working people, the vast majority, and they're actually quite wealthy, who have different point of view. And so it could be grassroots, really bottom up, or it could be what they're going to call astroturf or artificial turf movements, as in it's fake. It's done from above and made people think that it's populist. But Gilded Age, this comes from a book by, we've talked about him before, Mark Twain, the author of the Communist Manifesto. And I'm kidding. Mark Twain, the great author Mark Twain, wrote a book called The Gilded Age. And he was looking at this where all this wealth, these new rich, the nouveau rich, they call them, rich people, their mansions on Fifth Avenue, whatever it might be. And it hid the real problems of what's going on. And so gold gilded means you have something that's gilded with gold. It's covered with a thin layer of gold. It looks beautiful. It looks shiny. It looks rich. It looks solid gold. But you remove the gild and what's underneath. Well, that's hidden. And he implied it's hiding a rot. It's hiding a rot. And he was not alone. There was something rotten in society in the 1890s, and everybody sensed it. You have these mansions on Fifth Avenue and people living in alleys 2 blocks away. Not only living in alleys, paying rent to live in alleys. And so there's something going on. But it didn't start in the cities. It didn't start with the workers. This first movement started with the farmers. When there used to be a lot of farmers in the United States, the numbers were declining. It was an agrarian revolt. They felt left out and they wanted a party for them. The People's Party. It's coming. People's Populace. That's where it's come from. And here's the thing. They wanted representation because they thought there are good elements of capitalism. But if we don't have reform and elements of capitalism, you reform it or else. And they were terrified of the revolution. Could the revolution be anarchist? Could it be the new communist parties that seem to be developing? Could it be a dictatorship? Could it be military rule? Could it be ruled by just a few very wealthy people in an oligarchy? There was fear of revolution everywhere. That was the rot. And those who were extremely rich were fearful of that rot and feared revolution. And so this is the agrarian revolt. So we have to get to problems on the farm. So while we talk about labor unions and working problems on the farm, the element of capitalism in the new market was hitting the hard. And the number one problem was debt. We talked about this before. Farmers are always in debt. Now, this is the United States of America. Everybody's in debt. But farmers are always in debt. Remember, they can only pay, really one time a year, they can pay back their debts. And all it takes is one bad year. And so that debt hangs over them. And so with that, overproduction, production went up at that time. If there's production, overproduction, what happens to prices? Yeah, prices drop. Very good. There's a couple different reasons. More land than ever before came under the plow. So land that had been taken at gunpoint away from the various tribes here, a lot of it was under the plow before the Civil War, but more went under the plow, north and south. And then all this land taken. Remember the Homestead Act and more farmers, and California was coming in. Irrigation, that kind of thing. More land, overproduction. And I should add, not just the United States. There was more wheat production in Egypt. There was more production in India. There was more production in France. There's overproduction everywhere. And so that meant prices went down. The ironic thing is England just quit producing food. And hey, we can buy it everywhere. This might have an effect in World War I. That's another story for later on. Next, also more technology went into the farm. So, everyone, you can argue it's going to help or increase production. There's going to be windmill pumps and steel tip plows. But the biggie was that mechanical reaper. That mechanical reaper could do the work of 10 and 20 people to do grain. Also, in wheat production, you didn't need near as many people. So basically, one person could produce so much more. So more land, that allowed for bigger farms, more mechanization. I should also add, what about these farm families that had 10 kids to work the farm? Now you don't need 10 kids anymore. What did they do? Old habits are hard to break, as I said before. They're still having big families. What happened to those extra kids? Go to the city. So there's going to be a lot of internal migration. So all these increased production. There's something else they bought. Prices are going to drop. How do they buy more land? How do they buy more machines? What do they have to do? Goes into debt. So that increases debt. And it's a trap. I'll buy that reaper, and therefore I can produce more and get out of debt. Oh, everyone's doing the same thing. Price drops, now it's harder to get out of debt. I'll borrow more money and buy more land to get out of debt. Well, everyone else is doing it. I remember in the 1970s, everybody did that, and they bought those brand new form of reapers called a combine and new irrigation. And in the 80s, 3/4 of all farmers lost their farm. So this is not a new thing. Well, it might be new. There's not many farms left, unfortunately. Railroads. Railroads, and there's price discrimination. Railroads would discriminate against one customer to favor another one. And I think you probably can imagine what railroads would do. Think about a railroad. Let's talk one railroad. Look right here. The Great Northern Railroad went from Chicago to Seattle. So big harbor, Chicago, important city. Did this railroad, now this is price discrimination, did it charge more for small loads or big loads per ton? They charged a lot more for small loads. A railroad ideally would like to have one product on the entire train. So they only have to load it once and unload it once. They don't want to stop every stop and take a little bit off, put a little bit on. They used to do that. Almost all food was shipped on the railroad. And they didn't like it, so they basically got rid of that. You notice when you wait for a train, most of them. We live in a weird kind of trunk line here, but most of them are one car. Like here, it's all grain. Here, 3 mile long trains, which are really fun if you have to wait for them. Do they charge more for a long shipment, like Chicago to Seattle, or do they charge more per mile for a short one? Let's say they charge significantly more for short. Load it up once, unload it once, maximum profits. Now, this is actually bad policy for the country because in trains are cheaper than, like for example, today trucks. They've put significantly less pollutants in the air, but price discrimination. Think on small farmers. Small farmers are hurt. Right now, in the Highlands, some of the best wheat producing area in the United States. Some of the best. Winter wheat, it's fantastic. Yet they won't ship wheat unless you can fill 110 cars. It's a mile. That's one of 3 sections. 1 by 1 mile square farms, which are huge farms, meaning big. Smaller I stuff. But the biggest farmer price discrimination, so everyone got that big has a big advantage. Monopolies. Railroad monopolies, they can charge, overcharge. Back to this map right here. If you look at here, like Chicago, there are so many railroads going to Chicago. Or Kansas City too. Just rail junk. All these railroads go through there. And all these railroads go through here. Well, let's hear back up here. One railroad. So what can the Great Northern do here? They're the only railroad to ship that wheat out of here. 10 to 20 times more. And then make up for it by charging lower here when they have competition. So we have very few railroads now, but there are actually 3 railroads right here. One goes kind of this way, one here, and one sort of model. UP, Santa Fe, and the K&M, L&M. They pay 1/10 to ship their wheat. Remember when food prices were going up so much? Food prices have definitely finally kind of leveled off. When they were going so much up here, they weren't making any money. So the railroads and the food prices were making any money. In fact, I was just reading an article about tough times for wheat farmers in Montana. And prices are going up. That was a problem farmers had. Everybody's taking a piece. The food producers, the warehouses, railroads own the warehouses, they would charge just to store your wheat. So, here's a great cartoon then. Here's all the railroad costs. And look at the people going to get crushed by it. The people are tough. And remember, this is like a farmer's party. Here's the farmer warning them. Listen to the farmer. Farmers, urban people make fun of farmers, make fun of rural people, and they're trying to say, no, we have brains. I'm referring to a story there. Moving on, deflation. The government purposely had deflationary tactics. They want to keep prices low. So if deflation hits, the value of money goes up, pricing for the crops go down. And they can't pay back their debt. And that was conscious policy by the United States government. We have a little bit of that today. And remember I told you about the Coinage Act of 73? The farmers called it the crime of 73 to go on the gold standard, limiting the amount of gold in circulation, and therefore deflation. Also, taxes kept things regressive. Regressive taxes mean the lower your income, the greater percentage of taxes you pay. And the best example of this time were the tariffs. And here are farmers feeding the tariffs to the cow called protection, and the rich people profit because tariffs raise all prices. So lower your income. So small farmers, tariffs hit you hard. What is the tax today that acts very much like a tariff? So for working people, it really hits you, but it really helps for life. What kind of tax? We don't have one in Montana. Sales tax. Yeah, sales tax. I mean, whenever any states have a sales tax, I mean, wealthy people got the tax they want. Montana, we don't have a sales tax because in the state constitution, it says that any sales tax has to go to a vote to the people. And in 4 different times in my lifetime, there have been, used to be almost every time Republicans would take control of Congress, they'd go, saw the referendum, we'll go to have sales tax and they'd do 60% because people don't like sales tax. Yeah, it's really tough. But you go to a state like, Florida or Texas, which one, it's specifically designed to help wealthy people. With the idea, remember, they know what to do with the money. You give them more money, they'll invest in business or build a gold-gilded carriage. It's their money. But sales tax. Yeah, they were talking about, they were bemoaning this last week. The tax committee in Montana. We can't have a sales tax. We can't have a sales tax. That would help business. Republicans in the House proposed a 30% nationwide sales tax. And get rid of income tax. It'll be a huge tax rate for the very wealthy. I will pay a higher percentage anyways. But there's a lot of backlash, and Democrats are uniformly against it. So the point is, this is still an issue today. And what they want is inflation. They want more paper money. Remember the greenbacks that called them the Civil War because they had cheap green ink? Or more silver coins. Coin silver and gold. They called it bimetallism. If there's more silver, more gold in circulation, inflation. So they want inflation so prices could go up and they could pay back their debts. Yeah, go up now. And then let's get back. Every single one of these problems leads to more debt. So I'm saying that because I want to emphasize this debt overhanging them. You know, that's why I told you my dad grew up on was literally born on a sharecropper's farm. They lost it because of debt. My Uncle Hap drove the steam-powered tractor that they went into debt for into a creek. He lost control, drove in the creek, and that was like the dark story of my family. When Uncle Hap destroyed the tractor and they lost the farm. He never actually lived that down. That was a tough one. But debt. And so the first real effort by farmers to do something about it would be to group together. One of these groups is called the Grange, and it was in what we would call today the Midwest. Even though there are Grangers in Montana, it was not partisan. It was political, but they would support whatever party supported their goals. And they're going to pass a series of Granger laws in the state. So the farmers will support either party as long as they support these state laws to regulate railroad rates in the state. That's a lot of arms. So, for example, Illinois or Indiana or Iowa pass these laws to stop the price discrimination I talked about before. Indiana, they're all Republicans. Iowa, they're Democrats. So just whatever party supported them. And here's a Grange, where the farmers, but the whole idea is like the individual farmer. The individual farmer. Now, railroads immediately sued and said this was an illegal restraint of trade. And went to the Supreme Court, and Munn versus Illinois said it was constitutional for states to regulate railroads. They could do it. They have that power to make sure that railroads do not overcharge small farmers and give big breaks to the big or use their monopoly power. Railroads were furious, and then this was on the Illinois Central Railroad. But the Wabash Railroad, a smaller railroad, it basically just ran in Indiana and Illinois. And so let's say you're going from St. Louis to Chicago, carrying goods. They started going to Indianapolis, then to Chicago. They started crossing the state lines and then sued. They sued Illinois, saying, you can't have these laws because we cross state lines. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Wabash Railroad case said only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. Only the federal government. States can't. So states can still regulate it within the state, but if it crosses state lines, and once that happened, the Granger laws fell apart. So just put a little lines where however you want, that ended the Granger laws. And it kind of ended the Grange as a major political movement. They tried to be nonpartisan, and they couldn't get any political power. They did a couple things that lasted. They created a department store for farmers called Montgomery Ward's. That was a pretty big store until they mismanagement. They went out of business in the 1990s. Farmers Crop Insurance. They created their own insurance company. Still around today. Anybody know what they're called? What? Yeah, Farmers Insurance. No way, huh? Yeah, Farmers Insurance came from the Grange. They also set up warehouses, various things to help farmers. There were Granger halls in here, kind of social clubs in Montana. But they realized last couple things. Only the federal government can do this. And that meant a big shift. Only the federal government has the power. Like or dislike the federal government, they're the only ones who do this. Well, you can imagine how businesses will start attacking the federal government. And farmers, they felt ignored by both. Both political parties ignored farmers, and they felt left out. And the reason why was both political parties had their own internal issues, big city politics, new immigrants, and so we got to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. Farmers insurance. My house and car insurance are through farmers. Good story, huh? What are you going to remember for Friday? Yeah, sign registration. You know what also will help on Friday?